Welcome to the Day's Explainer. We're jumping right into a fascinating and, let's be honest, highly polarized debate over language policing. We're going to impartially break this all down by analyzing a recent, widely circulated monologue from conservative commentator Glenn Beck. Now, whether you totally agree with him or fundamentally oppose his views, dissecting exactly how he constructs his argument offers a really incredible look at the intersection of linguistics, culture, and politics. So let's dive right in.
Here's our roadmap for deconstructing this argument step by step. We'll be covering 1. The spark of outrage, 2. The evolution of clinical labels, 3. The language treadmill, 4. Words are not violence, and finally, 5. The linguistic counteroffensive.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the spark of outrage and the Huffington Post catalyst.
So Beck's open letter didn't just happen in a vacuum, right? It was actually a direct response to a specific piece of media commentary. The Huffington Post expressed some serious outrage, noting that a highly controversial word, the R word, was making an unfortunate comeback in public discourse. This expression of anger over the word's resurgence was the catalyst. It literally pushed Beck to formulate his comprehensive defense of using the term. It's a perfect example of how a single piece of media commentary can just trigger a much broader cultural manifesto.
Moving right along to Section 2, the evolution of clinical labels, from medicine to insult.
Now, Beck points out a genuinely fascinating historical pattern here. Words that we entirely accept today as common insults, they actually started out with distinct clinical origins. In the early days, words like idiot and moron were strictly scientific. But as time went on, society co-opted those medical terms and turned them into everyday insults. And because those original words became offensive, a new word was needed. Ironically enough, the word retarded was introduced much later on as a humane, progressive clinical replacement.
To really put this into perspective, Beck outlines exactly how scientists originally defined these words to categorize different levels of intellectual disability. If a patient had a severe disability, the official clinical diagnosis was idiot. If it was moderate, the medical term was imbecile. And for mild intellectual delays, the official scientific term was moron. It is absolutely wild to see these words, which are thrown around so casually today, laid out as strict medical classifications.
And here is the absolutely crucial point in Beck's historical mapping. Once the public started using those older terms, idiot, imbecile, moron, as insults, they obviously became highly offensive. To fix this, medical professionals and society went looking for a more humane alternative. Beck argues forcefully that the specific term at the center of the current outrage was actually invented by progressives. It was intended to be a compassionate, scientific, and progressive clinical term to replace the older, hurtful ones.
Which brings us to Section 3, the language treadmill and the cycle of euphemisms.
Linguists actually have a name for this. They call it the euphemism treadmill. And Beck's monologue maps this cycle out perfectly. Step 1, you introduce a humane descriptive term. Step 2, society inevitably begins using that new term as a negative insult. Step 3, because it's now an insult, the term itself is deemed deeply offensive. And Step 4, lather, rinse, repeat. You literally have to go create a brand new term. Beck argues that you can't simply replace words. If society itself doesn't change, the new word is just going to inherit the exact same negative meaning as the old word in this constant, never-ending cycle.
To illustrate this thesis, just look at the phrases we've used over the years, moving to terms like intellectually disabled, developmentally disabled, and people of special needs. But the present reality? Even a modern, carefully crafted phrase like people of special needs is already starting to be viewed as an unwelcome insult in professional settings. For Beck, this just proves the cycle never stops, and simply changing the syllables doesn't actually solve the underlying societal behavior.
Okay, Section 4, words are not violence, syllables with baggage.
So what's Beck's core philosophical stance here? He sums it up pretty vividly, saying, words are not violence, they are syllables with baggage. He is directly arguing against the modern cultural concept that words can literally cause physical harm or require safe spaces. To him, sure, words carry weight and history, that's the baggage, but they are ultimately just syllables, not acts of violence.
He goes pretty hard after the folks he views as language enforcers. He addresses his open letter directly to what he calls professional offense takers and euphemism evangelists. He openly mocks the endless creation of complex alternatives, like replacing older terms with phrases like cognitively divergent or a person with lived experience of slower neural pathways. He humorously compares all this complex wordsmithing to a thesaurus having a stroke. Plus, he suggests that forcing society to walk on eggshells actually backfires. By treating the word as forbidden fruit, he argues the word police actually give it significantly more cultural power and appeal.
And finally, Section 5, the linguistic counteroffensive, a satirical reclamation.
Now, this is a super important distinction to make when looking at his argument. Beck explicitly states he is not using the word as a cruel slur aimed at genuinely disabled individuals who, he notes, have far bigger problems to deal with in vocabulary. Instead, Beck pivots. He satirically deploys the controversial word as a descriptor for the very progressive worldview, political paradigms, and cultural forces that seek to ban it.
So, how exactly does he weaponize this term? Well, he aims it right at his political opponents. For climate policies, he says they literally retard economic growth. When it comes to cancel culture, which he argues treats offensive words as worse than actual policy failures, he labels it meta-retarded, and he broadly applies the term to things like DEI training and pronoun obsession. He's taking the banned word and aiming it squarely at the institutions trying to enforce the ban.
Just look at this quote, which really captures this whole bombastic, satirical vibe. Retardation so advanced that it loops back into performance art. He relies on extreme hyperbole here to mock what he views as an incredibly fragile culture. A culture produced, in his eyes, by the constant, exhausting policing of art, humor, and everyday conversation.
So on one side, you have the intended goal of the word police, which is to protect society and marginalized groups by eliminating offensive speech. But Beck argues the result is the exact opposite. He claims that this intense policing hasn't protected anyone. Instead, it has actively retarded social progress. It's created a culture so hyperfragile that it makes, in his words, Victorian ladies look like stand-up comedians.
Beck wraps up his open letter by essentially declaring a victory, stating, "The linguistic pendulum is swinging back, slowing down your march toward total semantic control." He's asserting that the word isn't going anywhere, and more broadly, that the cultural pendulum is finally swinging away from those who desire total control over our everyday vocabulary. He views himself as a recovering, compliant speaker who is just completely done playing along.
Which leaves us with a pretty big question to ponder as we wrap up today's explainer. Does policing language truly protect us and guide society forward toward a more empathetic future? Or, as Glenn Beck forcefully argues, does it simply trap us in an endless, fragile cycle of shifting syllables? It's a deeply complex debate about the power of words, and we really hope mapping out the anatomy of this argument helped clarify the broader cultural forces at play here.
Thanks for learning with us today.